You probably grew up believing your resilience was your greatest asset, but have you ever noticed how quickly a narcissist turns your unshakable strength into a weapon against you? When they realize you are too strong to be controlled through traditional intimidation, they pivot to something far more insidious. They unleash a quiet, devastating trick designed to make you willingly surrender your power. You felt it happening, didn't you? You knew something was deeply off when your natural confidence suddenly felt like something you had to apologize for. You would set a perfectly reasonable boundary, firm but kind, and somehow find yourself comforting them. Your intuition was screaming to protect you, but the psychological fog was so incredibly thick. You were not crazy, and you were certainly not imagining the shift. The part nobody talks about is how exhausted you became just trying to be a good person. You were pouring your boundless energy into a bottomless well, trying to fix a dynamic that was engineered to be entirely unfixable. Every time you showed your emotional endurance, they just added more weight to your shoulders. They watched you carry the heavy burdens and secretly smiled, knowing your empathy was keeping you trapped. You probably thought you were just going through a rough patch in the relationship, attributing their bizarre behavior to stress or past trauma. But what you experienced was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated assessment of your psychological fortitude. You were not too sensitive. In fact, you were targeted precisely because your emotional constitution was strong enough to endure their relentless chaos. They needed your stability the way a freezing person needs a roaring fire. But a narcissist does not just want to get warm, they want to consume the flames entirely. When they looked at your vibrant spirit, they did not see a partner or a friend to cherish. They saw a resource to be harvested. Your ability to solve problems and weather the darkest storms was exactly what made you so incredibly valuable to their agenda. Think back to the moment you finally put your foot down. You stood up straight, looked them in the eye, and refused to play their games. You expected them to explode in rage, and maybe they did at first. But when the rage did not break you, when your emotional fortress held strong against their assault, that is when the dynamic fundamentally shifted. They realized their standard tactics were completely useless. A terrifying realization washed over them. You were not going to fold. You were not the weak, easily malleable target they originally hoped for. Your spine was made of steel, and your mind was beginning to see right through their fragile illusions. For someone whose entire existence depends on controlling the narrative, your unyielding strength presented an absolute crisis that demanded an immediate, drastic response. This is where the profound confusion set in for you. You expected a fair fight, a mutual understanding, or at least a respectful parting of ways. Instead, you were met with a baffling change in their behavior that left you questioning your own sanity. You wondered if you had been entirely wrong about them all along. The ground beneath your feet vanished, replaced by a dizzying funhouse mirror of distorted reality. What most people never realize about narcissistic abuse is that the tactics change based on the target's endurance level. They do not use a hammer when a slow-acting poison will do the job much more efficiently. Your independence forced them to abandon the overt aggression and retreat into the shadows of manipulation. You were fighting a ghost, trying to logically explain your reality to someone actively rewriting it. You were surviving, yes, but at what terrible cost to your own soul? The vibrant, energetic person you used to be was slowly being replaced by a hypervigilant caretaker, constantly walking on eggshells. You were shrinking your monumental strength just to fit into their tiny, fragile world. And that is exactly where the trap was set. This is where the most dangerous psychological maneuver of all begins to unfold. Here is what was really happening behind the closed doors of their mind. When a narcissist encounters a spirit they cannot crush with force, they deploy their deadliest trick, weaponized fragility. They suddenly transform from the aggressor into the ultimate victim. They trade their terrifying rage for pitiful tears, collapsing in a heap of manufactured sorrow, effectively turning your own beautiful empathy against you. This changes everything about the power dynamic. Instead of fighting a tyrant, you suddenly found yourself tending to a wounded bird. The psychological brilliance of this maneuver is absolutely staggering. They recognized that your greatest strength was not just your resilience, but your immense capacity for deep compassion. By becoming helpless, they bypassed your strong boundaries and walked right through the front door. When they accused you of exactly what they were doing themselves, but did so through tears of betrayal, your logical mind short-circuited. You were standing there, completely baffled, apologizing for causing them pain when they had just spent hours emotionally devastating you. The part nobody tells you is that this was never about their actual sadness. It was a precise, calculated performance to paralyze your strength. They needed your attention the way a fire needs oxygen, and they realized that pity was the fastest way to get you to open the emotional valves. If they attacked you, you would raise your shields and defend yourself. But if they convinced you that you were somehow hurting them, your inherent goodness would force you to drop every single weapon you had. You surrendered your power just to prove you were not a monster. This is where it gets incredibly disturbing. They were actively exploiting your moral compass. They knew you possessed a conscience, a sense of guilt, and a desperate desire to be a good person. They possessed none of these things, but they studied your reactions closely. They essentially hijacked your nervous system, programming you to associate your own strength, independence, and boundaries with causing them deep agony. You stopped advocating for yourself because doing so made you feel guilty. Every time you asserted your needs, they crumbled, sighed, or looked at you with eyes full of manufactured despair. You internalized the lie that your strength was inherently abusive to their fragile nature. You began to dull your own shine, whispering instead of speaking, tiptoeing instead of walking, just to keep their delicate ego intact. To maintain absolute objectivity, I have to point out the stark reality of this dynamic. You believed their sorrow was genuine because you project your own humanity onto them. You thought, if I were crying like this, I would be in profound pain. But their tears were not a sign of emotional depth. They were a biological mechanism deployed for survival. You were comforting a predator wearing the bleeding skin of a sheep. They completely inverted reality. The one who was constantly absorbing the blows was suddenly labeled the abuser, and the one holding the emotional knife was demanding a deeply heartfelt apology. You spent countless sleepless nights agonizing over your own behavior, endlessly analyzing every word you spoke. Your brilliant mind, your strongest asset, was turned inward, spinning endlessly in a cycle of manufactured self-doubt. This is the hidden architecture of narcissistic control against a formidable opponent. It relies entirely on your willingness to take responsibility for things you never even did. The deadly trick is making the strongest person in the room believe they are the ones breaking the relationship. By tying your immense power to profound guilt, they managed to put a permanent leash on a lion they were completely terrified of. You were not failing. You were being systematically dismantled by an illusion. You poured your soul into healing someone whose only sickness was an insatiable addiction to your life force. They did not want to be saved. They only wanted you to die trying to save them. And just when you thought you had finally figured out the twisted rules of their dark emotional game, the entire foundation completely shifted underneath you. You thought you were fundamentally breaking them with your boundaries. You thought your newfound firmness was causing them genuine existential distress. But the truth is much darker, and this revelation changes everything you thought you knew. They were never actually broken by your strength. They were quietly studying it, looking for the microscopic stress fractures in your armor so they could pry you open once again. You believed they were fragile, barely holding on to their sanity, desperately needing your guidance to survive the cruel world. Here is the plot twist. The fragility was a heavy armor they wore to completely crush your independence. While you were crying tears of genuine exhaustion, worrying about their mental health, they were sleeping perfectly soundly. They were entirely unaffected by the chaos they continuously created. The moment you truly believed you were responsible for their emotional well-being was the exact moment they secured total control. You thought they lost access to your strength because you were finally saying no. But by saying no and then feeling agonizing guilt about it, you were still tethered to their reality. They didn't need your agreement, they only needed your emotional reactivity to prove they still owned you. You thought you were weak for constantly giving in to their sorrow. You judged yourself harshly for not being able to walk away when the red flags were everywhere. But you were not weak. You were surviving a highly sophisticated psychological siege. Your brain was doing exactly what a compassionate human brain is wired to do: alleviate the suffering of someone you loved. Your biology was weaponized against your logic. And then came the moment the mask finally slipped. Maybe they forgot they were supposed to be the victim for a split second. A flash of cold, calculating malice crossed their eyes before the tears quickly returned. Or perhaps they flawlessly executed a smear campaign against you while simultaneously claiming to be paralyzed by grief. That was the tiny glitch in the matrix. That was the moment your intuition finally woke up. You suddenly realized that true victims do not meticulously plan the destruction of the people trying to save them. The profound grief they displayed was utterly selective, turning on and off like a faucet depending on who was watching the performance. When you saw this terrifying inconsistency, the fog began to violently clear. You finally saw the invisible strings attached to your empathy leading straight back to their hands. You thought they forgot you during those periods of silent treatment. You believed they had finally moved on and left you in peace. They never stopped monitoring you. The silence was not an absence. It was an incredibly loud, active punishment designed to make you panic and crawl back, begging to carry their emotional baggage once more. They were holding their breath in the dark, waiting to hear your footsteps returning. But this time, something fundamental inside your spirit had permanently snapped. The deadly trick had finally expired because the illusion of their vulnerability was shattered. You looked at the crying, collapsing figure before you, and for the very first time, you felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard clarity. The well of infinite compassion you had reserved for them had finally run completely, unapologetically dry. What they failed to calculate in their grand manipulative strategy was the sheer limit of human endurance. They assumed your empathy was an exploitable resource that would magically regenerate forever. They pushed you right past the breaking point, expecting you to shatter into a million pieces. Instead, you forged yourself into something completely unrecognizable. The fire they tried to steal ended up burning their hands. You stopped seeing a misunderstood soul who just needed unconditional love. You finally saw the bottomless void. You recognized that pouring your beautiful light into their endless darkness was never going to illuminate them, it was only going to extinguish you. And in that terrifying, breathtaking moment of psychological awakening, the entire architecture of their false reality began to rapidly collapse around them. The audience of your life always wants to see karma deliver a swift, cinematic blow. But the universe delivers a much quieter, more absolute justice to a narcissist. When their deadly trick fails, they are left with a terrifying reality. They have completely exposed themselves to the one person strong enough to see the truth. The facade is irrevocably shattered, and there is no psychological superglue that can ever fix it. The psychological consequences of their actions are profoundly inescapable. By destroying the trust of the strongest, most compassionate person in their life, they seal their own fate of perpetual emotional starvation. They cannot experience authentic intimacy because intimacy requires profound vulnerability. Since they weaponize vulnerability, they can never genuinely feel it. They are locked outside the house of human connection. As you begin to silently withdraw your energy, a deep, unshakable panic sets into their hollow core. They realize they have burned down the only sturdy shelter they ever had. The people they surround themselves with now are easily manipulated, but they offer no real warmth. The narcissist is left ruling over a kingdom of absolute shadows, sitting on a lonely throne, desperately missing the brilliant light you used to provide. They will eventually try the pity play on new targets, and it might work for a little while. But nobody else will ever have the emotional stamina to endure the grueling marathon of their abuse the way you did. The new supplies will quickly crack, fail, or abandon them, entirely unable to carry the immense weight of the narcissist's chaotic demands. The narcissist will constantly measure every new person against your memory. You thought they walked away completely victorious, completely unscathed by the devastation they left in their wake. But look closer at the reality of their existence. Their life is an endless, exhausting performance, an eternal cycle of seeking new hosts to drain because they cannot generate their own emotional sustenance. They are prisoners of their own defensive mechanisms, unable to rest, unable to heal, unable to grow. The ultimate justice is not that they suffer some dramatic, public downfall. The justice is that they have to wake up every single morning and be themselves. They have to live inside a mind that is constantly at war with reality, forever terrified of being exposed as a fraud. The profound loneliness of their existence is something you could never wish on your worst enemy, yet it is a prison they built with their own hands. Meanwhile, you are no longer there to absorb the terrible shockwaves of their inner turmoil. The emotional buffer you provided has been permanently removed. Every slight, every failure, and every rejection they face now hits them directly, without your protective empathy to soften the blow. They must face the brutal consequences of their own toxic behavior without you standing in the way to take the blame for their misery. They will occasionally check your social media or ask mutual friends about you, desperately hoping to see that you are struggling without them. They need you to be shattered so they can feel significant. But instead, they are met with the agonizing silence of your complete indifference. You are not posting angry quotes. You are not trying to prove anything. You have simply evaporated from their twisted emotional radar. This total loss of access is a psychological death blow to the narcissistic ego. They built an entire false reality entirely dependent on your participation. When you silently decline the invitation to play your assigned role, the play cannot continue. The heavy curtain falls on an empty theater. The applause dies out. They are left alone on a dark stage, wearing a tragic mask, with absolutely nobody left to watch the show. Your absence becomes the ultimate, undeniable proof of their profound failure. They tried to break the strongest spirit they had ever encountered, and instead, they inadvertently taught that spirit how to be utterly invincible. They became the harsh catalyst for your ultimate awakening, losing their grip on reality while you finally found yours. Now, the story pivots entirely. Now, we focus solely on your beautiful rise. You are no longer the anxious, drained, guilt-ridden caretaker you were forced to become. The fog has fully lifted, and the vibrant colors of your actual reality are bleeding back into your daily life. You can finally breathe deeply without wondering if the simple act of inhaling will somehow trigger an emotional crisis in someone else. Your nervous system is slowly, beautifully resetting to a state of profound, lasting peace. Healing from this specific type of psychological warfare requires a massive shift in how you view your own power. You must realize that your immense empathy was never a weakness, even if they successfully weaponized it against you for a season. Your compassion is the hallmark of your humanity. You simply learned a vital, painful lesson about guarding your sacred energy. You learned that not everyone deserves access to your light. The process of recovery is about actively reclaiming the fractured pieces of your identity. You start trusting your gut intuition again, knowing it was always trying to save you. You start setting ironclad boundaries, not out of malice, but out of a fierce, uncompromising self-love. You realize that saying no to toxic emotional demands is the most profound way of saying yes to your own deeply deserved joy and tranquility. There is a monumental power in your newfound clarity. You can spot the subtle micro-expressions of manipulation from a mile away now. The manufactured tears, the subtle guilt trips, the projection, they are no longer effective tools against your mind. They are just pathetic tricks deployed by emotionally bankrupt magicians. You watch the performance with absolute detachment, completely immune to the spell they are trying to cast. You will eventually stop waiting for the closure they will never provide, because you understand that closure is something you manufacture for yourself. You do not need an apology from the person who systematically tried to dismantle your sanity. The truth is your closure. The understanding of their deep, unchangeable pathology is the key that finally unlocks your prison cell. You have absolutely nothing left to figure out. As you rebuild your life, you will discover that the strength they tried to destroy has only grown more magnificent. The resilience that terrified them is now the unshakable foundation of your brilliant new future. You survived an emotional apocalypse, a literal hijacking of your soul. Everything else you face in this world will seem incredibly manageable compared to the agonizing psychological maze you have already conquered. You learn to celebrate your emotional freedom in the quiet, mundane moments of life. Drinking your morning coffee without anticipating a conflict. Going to sleep without dissecting a 3-hour circular argument. listening to your favorite music without someone telling you why it is wrong. These small, beautiful moments of ordinary peace become your greatest victories. You have successfully taken back the deed to your own life. The incredible plot twist of your recovery is that you are not just returning to the person you used to be. You are becoming someone entirely new, someone forged in the intense fires of radical truth. You possess a wisdom that cannot be taught in any book. You hold a deep, unshakable certainty about your own worth. You are finally untouchable, moving through the world with an invisible shield of hard-won psychological insight. You are the hero of this story. You always were. The antagonist was merely a shadow sent to test the limits of your magnificent light. They served their terrible purpose, and now their chapter in your book is permanently closed. Look at the vast, open pages stretching out before you. The pen is firmly back in your steady hand. You are free to write whatever beautiful, peaceful, unapologetic destiny you want for yourself. The ultimate victory is not revenge. It is living a life where their memory has entirely lost its sting. You realize the chains holding you were made of nothing but your own misplaced compassion. You finally defeated their deadliest trick by daring to give your fierce, relentless empathy entirely to yourself. The greatest punishment for a narcissist is watching the person they tried to break finally become impossible to control.